Welcome to AEIOU, a podcast about Austria. I'm Andrew, your host. In the previous episode, we tracked Austria's performance during World War I, from the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo in June 1914 to the final capitulation in November 1918. In this episode, we'll focus in part on the home front during the war. However, we should first discuss some of the events during the war that our overall analysis from the last episode skipped over. First and foremost among these events was the occupation of Serbia, which lasted from January 1916 until the end of the war, so a total of nearly 2 years. The country was divided into two occupation zones, Eastern and Western, with the Eastern zone administered by Bulgaria. In the Western Austro-Hungarian zone, administration was undertaken by the Military General Governorate of Serbia, initially appointed by Emperor Franz Joseph to administer the Serbian occupation, was Johann von Salasievis, who was both a general in the Austro-Hungarian army and an ethnic Croat. A Hungarian, Lajos Taloxi, oversaw civil administration in the territory. With Serbia placed under martial law, not only were civil liberties severely curtailed, but the human rights situation also deteriorated rapidly. The Austro-Hungarian army responded to partisan and guerrilla activity with reprisals, summary executions, and public hangings. The long-term plan for the occupied region of Serbia was incorporation into Austria-Hungary. Perhaps surprisingly, the plan was another source of conflict between the Austrian government and that of Hungary, still led by István Tisza, who, as we discussed in the previous episode, had been in a small minority of voices opposing a declaration of war. In addition to harsh occupation policies directed against Serbian nationalists, the Austro-Hungarian forces took tens of thousands of hostages in hopes of preventing additional guerrilla activity. Nearly 200,000 Serbians were sent to concentration camps both in the occupation zone and in Austria, including the infamous Mauthausen camp, which was also used under the regime of history's most famous Austrian. Conditions in the camps were poor and the death toll quite high. At one camp in Bohemia, 40 people died per day. Out of the total number of interned Serbs, including POWs, the percentage who died was perhaps as high as 20%. As noted, the Austro-Hungarian occupation of Serbia ended with the end of the war. Ultimately, it was extremely costly to the Serbian people. Perhaps as many as a third of the people in the country died during the war, with more than half consisting of civilians. In hindsight, the occupation has, not without reason, been called a genocide. Scholars continue to debate this point more than 100 years later. Regarding the harshness of the occupation, reasons suggested for it have included that the war was precipitated by a Serbian act of violence against a symbol of the Austrian nation. In this regard, the war between Austria-Hungary and Serbia took on a nationalistic air that perhaps other fronts of the war did not. Additionally, as scholars have established over the decades, there was unusually high unit cohesion and esprit de corps in the Austro-Hungarian military. In his famous work on the army, entitled Beyond Nationalism, István Deák, a major historian of the Habsburg monarchy, argues that the army was a bastion of stability in a deteriorating late Habsburg monarchy, and that the officer corps in particular played an essential role in this stability. As we have covered in multiple episodes, the late Habsburg monarchy was characterized by the liberal hold on government being increasingly challenged by ethnic interest groups and economic dissatisfaction from both the left and the right. However, even as these cleavages grew, the officer corps managed to avoid being affected by them. From the standpoint of ethnicity, the army stood apart from increasing conflict because it represented a largely meritocratic institution in which individuals could rise regardless of their ethnic origins. With regard to economics, although the pay for Austrian officers was notably lower than that for French or German officers, the egalitarian ethos of the military lent itself to preventing the emergence of class resentments. For instance, Deák notes, regardless of relative rank, officers addressed one another, and often were addressed by their enlisted men, with the familiar second-person pronoun du, rather than the formal sie. Such conventions, as well as what Deák describes as the fundamentally decent administration, unheard of liberties, economic progress, and lack of political boundaries between the Carpathian Mountains and the Swiss Alps, helped to foster an environment of toleration. This sense of familiarity dovetailed with the language policies of the army, which required officers to speak any language spoken by at least 20% of their men, giving rise to a leadership that, while Austrian, could not be said to be German, Hungarian, or any other ethnicity. In addition, despite the fact that so many officers rose from the peasantry and the artisanal and working classes, the more economically based parties, particularly the Social Democrats, failed to gain ground among military men in the last quarter of the 19th century. Other factors that Diak acknowledges as important to creating the non-nationalistic military of the Habsburg monarchy include the military academies and the relationship between the emperor as supreme commander of the army and the officers. He writes, quote, "The military schools of the Joint Army remained stubbornly indifferent to the social background, except in the case of archdukes, ethnicity, and religion of their students." End quote. The pipeline from these academies into the officer corps operated for such a long time, and Franz Joseph reigned for so long that, by the turn of the century, nearly the entirety of the officer corps had never served another sovereign. This fact contributed enormously to the officers' sense of being direct representatives of the dynasty, in addition to, or perhaps instead of, the state. This relationship, which transcended ethnicity and politics, became primary for many of them. As Diak notes, quote, "This alone protected them from the nearly irresistible influence of nationalist and social political agitation." End quote. It should be reiterated that with the increasingly nationalistic conflict of the war itself, the army perhaps lost some of its previous imperviousness to nationalism, resulting in the harshness of the occupation of Serbia. Here we should turn to the home front. As noted in episode 18, the minister-president at the outbreak of the war was Count Karl von Sturck, who had functionally suspended the Reichsrat a few months before the war began. Since that time he had been ruling by decree. Declaration of war at the end of July brought even stricter rule from Vienna, with censorship imposed throughout the empire. The refusal of Sturck to convene the legislature and his preference to rule by decree did not go unnoticed by the Austrian population, however. In addition, the Austro-Hungarian army's fortunes in the war would have economic and social effects on the Habsburg monarchy in its final years. As those fortunes turned particularly bad, so did the political atmosphere in Austria. It provided a particularly shocking example on October 21, 1916, when Minister-President Sturck was gunned down by a left-wing assassin. On that day, Sturck was having lunch in the Meisel and Schaden Hotel in Vienna. As the minister-president was completing his meal, enjoying a dessert of plum cake, 37-year-old Friedrich Adler shot him 3 times at point-blank range. Adler shouted, "Down with absolutism, we want peace." If the surname Adler sounds familiar, it's because the assassin Friedrich Adler was the son of the chair of the Social Democrats, Victor Adler. Friedrich was arrested at the scene and taken into custody. Sturck died. Emperor Franz Joseph appointed Ernest von Kerber as Sturck's successor. Kerber had served once already in the office, from 1900 to 1904. His second government was short-lived, however, because on November 21, 1916, the emperor died at the ripe old age of 86. Franz Joseph had been Austria's monarch for nearly 70 years. Over those years, Austria had been transformed from an absolutist reactionary monarchy with little popular representation in government into a multinational democratic empire, as dynamic as it was unstable. Because of the assassination of Franz Ferdinand 2 years earlier, the crown prince was now the Archduke Karl, the son of Franz Joseph's nephew, the Archduke Otto Franz. At the time of his accession, Karl was 29 years old, and all but 2 of those years had been spent with no expectation of ever wielding imperial power. He had received only minimal training to be monarch. For about 6 months before his accession, he served as a corps commander in the army. Karl took 2 important steps almost as soon as he took the throne. First, as noted, he fired Kerber and appointed his own minister-president, Heinrich Karl Maria Graf von Clam-Martinique. In addition, the new emperor reached out to the French government to negotiate a peace treaty. France insisted that Austria accept Italy's territorial acquisitions as part of any deal. Karl refused, and the negotiations ended there. However, in the last year of the war, French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau leaked the correspondence, resulting in the resignation of Karl's foreign minister and a rift with the Germans, who insisted on full military control over Austrian infrastructure thereafter. The war was all but lost already, however, so this transfer of full control to Germany made little difference. It remained only for Karl to figure out how to remain in power in the face of losing the war. Several Habsburg territories had made it clear as the Austro-Hungarian war effort flagged that they sought independence. In addition, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson had announced his intention to seek a final peace according to his 14 points, which centered around self-determination for ethnic groups in Central and Eastern Europe. From the vantage point of the Habsburg family, such developments had been in sight for quite some time. We noted in a previous episode the oft-considered notion of expanding the dual monarchy into a triple monarchy by giving one of the crown lands of Austria status equal to that of Hungary. Emperor Karl himself was a proponent of doing so with Croatia. Among the final tactics Karl considered to preserve the political unity of the monarchy was a Hungarian solution for every nationality desiring self-government. In 1906, a commission led by Archduke Franz Ferdinand, then the Crown Prince, had recommended the creation of a federation of 15 national territories. With power devolved nearly entirely to the provincial level, this state, Die Vereinigten Staaten von Großösterreich, that is, the United States of Greater Austria, would satisfy, it was hoped, the national aspirations of the empire's dozen or so nations. However, the plan never advanced beyond informal discussion, and with the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, it was shelved for the time being. Emperor Karl revived the idea in the final days of Austria-Hungary, reconvening the Reichsrat for the purpose of discussing a reconfiguration of the Habsburg monarchy as a confederation. However, the horse had already left the barn, and the different ethnic groups instead pursued full independence. On October 16, 1918, Karl granted independence to Galicia and subsequently declared that the Habsburg monarchy was now a federal union of Germans, Czechs, Ukrainians, and so-called South Slavs. However, via U.S. Secretary of State Robert Lansing, President Wilson indicated that Karl's solution would be refused by the victors. By the end of October, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and the state of Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs, ultimately to be called Yugoslavia, had stated their intentions to declare independence at the earliest possible moment. The minister-president resigned and was replaced by Heinrich Lammesch, who advised the emperor that he should abdicate if only temporarily. On Armistice Day, November 11, 1918, Karl did not abdicate, but instead recognized the independence of German Austrians and relinquished any responsibility on his part to participate in their political future. The following day, the Republic of German Austria was proclaimed, and 4 days after that, a Hungarian republic was declared. The Habsburg monarchy was no more. We'll end this episode here. In the next episode, we'll discuss how the defunct monarchy ultimately evolved into the First Austrian Republic. Thanks for listening.